So, yeah, today we are now in the last few chapters of Second Samuel. As per plan, we were trying to do at least 20 and 21 today so that we can have the concluding study in Second Samuel next week, which will be 22, 23, 24. So, as it stands, it's a large chunk that we are trying to bite and chew today. So, to before we get into that study, I thought we'll do a quick recap, starting almost from the narrative in chapter 15 onwards, because that sets a context for what we are looking at in 20 and 21. So in 15, chapter 15 is where we saw Absalom rebelling against his father, King David, right? And David, to protect Jerusalem, he leaves the city because otherwise there is a threat that Absalom would destroy the city to get at David. So he leaves the city along with a few faithful men and he flees to the east of the Jordan. But Absalom's rebellion is very short-lived. In just the space of 2-3 chapters narrative, we know that Absalom is defeated. He gets bad advice and he is defeated and he's killed by Joab. But this is much against David's wishes, right? David does not want Absalom to be killed. But Joab goes by his own guiding lights, and then in the interest, what he perceives as the interest of Israel and David, he kills Joab. And this leads to a great period of mourning for David. And he has to be jerked out of that mourning, right? In chapter 19, we saw how he had to come out of that mourning and then resume leadership. And then we see this in chapter 19, which is what we did last time. We saw how David was on his journey back to Jerusalem to reassume his kingship. And we saw a series of people he meets and how he deals with them. And we saw how all Israel, the northern tribes, as well as Judah, together assume, they acknowledge David as king, but it's an uneasy peace. We see that Israel is very deeply divided, right? So this rebelliousness that got triggered by Absalom has not died down. Even with David coming back to Jerusalem, the tribes do not trust each other. Most of the tribes seem to see Judah as trying to get more recognition and a better privileged position under David's new reign. So there's a very uneasy peace, right? And we see that there is largely a split into two of Israel. The northern tribes, led by the tribe of Benjamin, which is Saul's tribe, is on one side, and Judah is on the other. So that sets the context for that's the context in which we will enter today's study. Just reading the last verse of last time, chapter 19, it ends with, the comments of the men of Judah were more severe than the men of Israel. So this is this discussion they are having about who will have a greater share in David's kingdom, greater position, etc. So 19 tells us that it's an uneasy peace that exists. And 20 begins with that blowing up into a full-scale rebellion, right? So if you look at 20 and 21, we see that there's a series of small narrative stories, all linked together. Sometimes the link is not it's more thematic than chronological. So to look at this 2 chapters, I kind of divided it into 3 sections, right? So instead of having a breakout session, what I thought is we will have each section, we will look at a theme. So through our discussions that we will have, we will try to draw an application from each section. So the first section is looking at chapter 20, verses 1 to 14. And the main thing that I want to look at in that portion is the contrast between Abishai and Joab. Okay, I'll get more into details on that as we proceed. But to understand that contrast and to draw an application from that, we need to look at a larger picture. We need to look at all we know about Joab and Abishai from the past, as well as we need to peek into the future, into the subsequent chapters, as well as Second Kings and all of that, to understand that and to draw an application from that. The second section that I wanted to look at was that chapter 4, verse 14 to 22 of chapter 20. And there, one person stands out, right? This unnamed, wise, old. Oh, I use the word old. You tend to think of wisdom and age going together, though the Bible, I think, if I remember rightly, does not call her an old woman. It's just a wise woman, right? So, this unnamed wise woman of Abel, the city of Abel of Beth Makkah. So we will look at that and see what we can learn about wisdom from that section. The third section is the next chapter, right? All of the next chapter. So there is a story of a long delayed justice for the Gibeonites. And intertwined with that is a story of Rizpah, right? And how she pleads, unspoken plea through her actions for mercy for her sons. So that's the third section. So we look at that as the third question. So let's get into the first question, the first section, which is chapter 20, verse 1 to 14. So this, I feel, is all about setting priorities. So what do we see? We see that Sheba, a Benjaminite, is now the new leader of the rebellion against David, right? So he wants no share. He feels that they will not get, other than Judah, they will not get any share in David's new kingdom. And so they decide to rebel against David. And he collects together his army and he goes and takes refuge in the city of Abel, right? Now, David, earlier in the last chapter, is very displeased with Joab for obvious reasons, right? Joab is not very obedient to his commands. So he appoints another man from his family, Amasa, as the commander of his army. So David asks Amasa to he gives him a deadline. He says, 3 days, go and gather together the men of Judah, right? And so that we go to quell this rebellion that Sheba has triggered quickly. But then we see Amasa is not a very efficient commander. Neither is he very timely in obeying David's orders. He does not return in 3 days. So now David, instead of turning to Joab, we see he turns to Abishai. And he asks Abishai to lead the army. Though David asks Abishai to lead the army and put down the rebellion, we see the army is referred to, if you look closely, Joab's men, right? So Joab is still the de facto leader, seen as the leader, though David wants to strip him of that position. So, and then that is verse 1 to 6. Then in verse 7 to 13, we see Joab, actually something that we begin to recognize in Joab, right? He knows that Abishai and Joab are brothers. And they are both sons of David's sister, right? So Joab now sees a threat in Amasa. He sees Amasa as someone who is contending for his position as the commander of David's armies. So he finds a way to slaughter Amasa. We have seen this before when he kills Abner for the same reason, right? Also, he had personal vengeance to take there. So we see how he, in the second portion, 7 to 13, is a narrative about how Joab kills his rival Amasa, and then he appears to become reappointed, and he leads the quelling of the rebellion. And when you look further towards the end of the chapter, where there is this 2-3 verses which kind of has this set of credits, right? In David's kingdom, who are the ministers, who's the priest, who's the commander, we see that Joab has reassumed the position of as the commander of David's army. So, to look at an application from this portion, right? While we look at also the set of events that are playing out, let's focus on the two characters that David is focusing on, Joab and Abishai. David is rejecting Joab and he's turning to Abishai as his fallback when his appointee Amasa fails. Okay? So we see clearly David is showing a preference for Abishai over Joab. So, like I said, to really understand and get into the first question, let's take a look back at what we know about Joab and Abishai. Okay. Remember, Joab is the one who colludes with David to protect David's reputation. When David has this adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, it is Joab who conspires with David and gets Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, eliminated. That's in Second Samuel chapter 11. Then we also see Joab trying to reconcile David and Absalom. After Absalom murders Amnon and flees, David is pining for Absalom. He thinks he has lost both Amnon and Absalom. And seeing David pining and ignoring his kingly responsibilities, Joab conspires with this Tekoan woman to try to bring about a reconciliation between David and Absalom. That is in chapter 14. Then again, in chapter 18, we see how David comes back, and he does not probably expect Absalom to rebel against David. So when Absalom rebels against David, Joab sees Israel being split into two. He doesn't want that. So he wants, even though David ordered that Absalom should not be killed, Joab ends up killing him when he gets an opportunity to quell the rebellion and to remove rebelliousness also from the kingdom, right? So we see that David, in a very apparent way, when you look at it, no, he's very intelligent, he's brave, he has foresight. He seems to do a lot of things that seem to protect David's and Israel's interests. But we also know that Joab is very hot-tempered. One, we see how he carries a vengeance a long time against Abner, because Abner murdered his brother. Also, there's a threat that Abner would be appointed as commander over the army. Therefore, he murders Abner. And we see the same thing repeating in today's study, where he murders Amasa. So that's a quick spectrum of things we know about Joab. What about Abishai? If you recall, in 1 Samuel chapter 26, when David was fleeing from Saul, there was one instance when Saul is camped in the plain and all those tents are pitched and Saul's tent is in the center. When David wants to enter into the tent of Saul and he asks, who will volunteer to come with me? It is Abishai at that time who volunteers for the dangerous mission. So along with David, he enters, creeps into Saul's tent at night, right? And then he sees an opportunity to kill Saul, short circuit David's ascension to the throne. And he says that if you cannot do it, I will do it. God has given us this opportunity. But David stays his arm and tells him, don't do it. And Abishai is quick to obey, right? So he responds with obedience to David. So he's responding to David's call for a volunteer in a dangerous mission. He tries to seize an opportunity, but when David tells him no, he obeys, right? And David tells him why no. There, if you read that portion, we see how David is saying that he's not supposed to touch Saul the anointed, because he is also anointed of the Lord. And he's quick to identify with that. In 2 Samuel chapter 16, remember when David was fleeing to the east of the Jordan, there's this Benjaminite, Shimei, who comes and curses, hurls curses at David. It is Abishai who actually wants to kill Shimei to punish him. But again, David restrains him. And David restrains him on a spiritual basis. And Abishai is quick to recognize that and obey David's order. So again, we see that same characteristic. Then again, in chapter 20, which we are studying today, it is to Abishai that David, we see, turns where Amasa fails him. Though Joab is the more experienced commander. Probably Joab is the one that people also recognize as the commander. But David is now turning to Abishai because he knows that Abishai is someone who will obey him, right? Whereas Joab is sometimes tends to take his own decisions, if I may say that. When you look a little further in chapter 21, verse 15 to 17, we see there is a battle with the Philistines that's described. And we see David is also in this battle. And in the thick of the battle, David is about to be killed by this giant Philistine. It's Abishai who's close enough to step in and protect David, right? And save David's life. So we see Abishai is always watchful. He's near David. He's very protective of David's life. He's very obedient to David's commandment, to David's orders. And finally, if you look ahead into chapter 23, there's a list of brave men of David. You would have expected Joab to be listed. Strangely, he is not. Abishai is remembered, and Joab is only remembered as Abishai's brother. Even in First Chronicles, you'll see the same thing. The same incident is narrated where David wants some water from Bethlehem, and Abishai is the one who volunteers to do that. So we see Abishai is remembered for his obedience, for his courage, for his loyalty, whereas Joab is not actually mentioned by the author of the scripture. So here's our question. Why do you think David is so displeased with Joab that he turns to Amasa first and then Abishai to lead his army? From what we are told, what is the difference between the two in their priorities and loyalties, right? So just look at the two characteristics and see what we can learn about their priorities and their loyalties. And as Christians, what lesson can we draw from this comparison between Joab and Abishai? Is there a lesson for us here? That's our first question, right? I would encourage an open discussion, chat also, if you're comfortable with that, but just feel free to speak out. Okay.
So I'm just taking a cue from there in the application question that you have. One is what lesson can we draw? One is it our performance that matters to God, or is it our dependence and obedience to God that matters? So I think performance of doing great things or doing something for God, vis-a-vis, do we depend on him, and do we trust him for God to work through us, whatever he has planned us to do? So that's one thing I see in contrast to Joab
and Abishai.
From Abishai, the lesson that I could glean is, going by the three instances, he was loyal, he was obedient, but he did not know David's thinking. So the lesson we can at least I glean is, do we know God's heart? Do we know what is God passionate about? What is his heart beating for? So only then we will be able to obey him correctly, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah.
Only thing is, I was just wondering about the statement, did Abishai know David's heart? I think in those three instances, all the times when David explained. So one thing is the identity of Israel and identity of David is very important. Identity of Saul, right? The chosen people, God's anointed king. Saul is also anointed by God, right? Abishai he's impulsive. We are told that these three brothers were very hot-headed and impulsive. Abishai, Joab, as well as the other brother, I forgot his name, who was murdered by Abner, who was killed by Abner, right? All of them, one characteristic that links them is they are hot-headed. But Abishai is willing to listen. When David tells him, explains this, in each situation, we see Abishai listens. Whereas Joab does not, right? Joab still takes his own counsel.
Yeah.
I think that's one thing. If you just go back and read all those instances, we'll see David actually explaining it at a spiritual level, and Abishai actually agreeing to that, because he stays his arm. He does not kill Shimei, he does not kill Saul. Whereas Joab is rather rebellious. He goes by his own counsel.
He's on his own.
And he gets his opportunities. Any other thoughts? Yeah, so I think Sarah really hit on the application that even I found. One is, like we said, Joab is very independent of David's orders when it comes to crunch situations. He does not hesitate to disobey direct orders, make his own choices. And always it is apparently in the greater interest of Israel, or what he perceives as David's interest. So he's very, very pragmatic, very earthly, very national in his perception. He's losing that perspective of God's chosen people, God's anointed king, and God's purpose, the hand of God behind all of this, right? So that's something we see about Joab, right? And David's final assessment of Joab also in 1 Kings 2, he tells, right, Joab is a man of blood, he's a murderer. So he asks Solomon to actually hold him to account, right? Whereas Abishai, we see, is always near David. Not just that word near, is in many ways, he's physically, emotionally, and spiritually near David. He may not have recognized some of the spiritual aspects, but when he's told and taught, he's obedient. He puts aside his impulses, his own interest, and actually obeys David, right? So both cannot, Abishai and Joab cannot claim that they are unaware about God's purpose for David and for Israel, right? But their actions and their lives are defined by their differing priorities. Job's priorities are David, Israel, and self, but not in that order. He often puts self and Israel above obedience to David, right? And whenever I say David, I'm talking about David as God's anointed king. So he's even, in a way, if we can say that he's putting aside God's priorities also. As for Abishai, his first priority is always David, right? It is Abishai that connects spiritually to David's reasoning, surrenders his own instincts and self-interest in obedience, right? Killing Saul would have short-circuited the way to the throne, and it would have been privileged. They would have ended all that running around very fast, but he puts that aside. So from a Christian perspective, as a Christian, what can we learn from this? I was just looking and seeing, what does Jesus say about his own priority and his willingness to be obedient to his Father's will? He said in John 5:30, I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. And in Luke 22:42, yet not my will, but your will be done. So Jesus' priority was always his Father's will. His purpose was defined by that, and he stayed true to that purpose. As a result, if you look at Jesus' ministry, right, we see all the characteristics that tell us that we see, right? He has full dependence on the Holy Spirit. The centrality of prayer in Jesus' ministry, the centrality of the Word of God, and the willingness to exalt the Father, and the love and integrity that he shows, right, when he deals with people around him, right? And that is why Jesus, the Lord proclaimed well in advance, right, at the time of his baptism, that this is my one dear son, and in him I take great delight, right? He's speaking ahead. And on that rock, God built his plan of salvation and restoration. And as Christians, we are followers of Christ. Therefore, Jesus is our primary focus. Sometimes I think the mission and the institutions that we build as a mission becomes more important. And we see that many times in missions that fail, missions that are compromised, because the focus is the interest of the mission rather than focusing on the reason for the mission. So when even missions and institutions are built, and then the mission and the institution takes higher priority than the foundation and the reason for their identity, that's a recipe for failure. The Lord builds on our obedience and our willingness to give priority to Jesus, right? So that's a lot like what Sarah was saying. And that's something that I could see as an application from this portion. So with that, let's move on to the next section, okay? This is verse 14 to 22. This is about the wise woman from Abel of Beth Makkah. So we see Sheba has gone and taken, he's actually entered into the city, and that's where he's trying to consolidate his position. He's going to use that city as his launch pad for the rebellion. And Joab, with his forces, they lay siege to the city. And they are building this ramp to go over the walls, and there's an imminent breakthrough into the city. And Abel of Beth Makkah is a very important city, right? There are a lot of surrounding cities around it also that depend on it. And they are known for one thing, and which is the wisdom of the residents. That's why this lady, this wise woman says, she refers to that, right? The saying that is there in the land, that if you have a problem, why don't you go and inquire in Abel, and they will tell you how to solve your problem, right? So this city is known for its wisdom. And in this woman, we see an exemplar of the wisdom of the city, right? She is unnamed, but she demonstrates the truth of the saying that the city is known for its wisdom, because we see her single-handedly leading from the front. She defuses the rebellion, she defuses the tension, and saves the city from destruction, right? So what we have to do, you would have read that portion. I'm not going to describe, right? How she identifies Joab as a person to speak to. She speaks to him. She speaks to him in language that he understands, right? That do not let the inheritance of Israel be destroyed. The importance of Abel to Israel. And then she finds out what is his concern. And then she says, okay, I will deal with that concern. If your concern is Abel, I'm sorry, Sheba, we will deal with that. And how she acts on that with the rest of the city, and therefore saves the city from destruction. So examine what this wise woman says and does. What can we learn from her and the residents of Abel about wisdom in action? So it's not just wisdom as in knowledge, but we see wisdom in action here, right? So that's the next question. What can we learn from this woman and the residents of Abel about wisdom in action? Okay, I'll just move on. So this unnamed woman is an exemplar, right? Abel is known for the wisdom of its residents, and she's an example. From her, we can see why they are wise. So if we examine what she does and everything that's happening, one we see is she feels empowered. The city is wise because the woman, even a woman, feels empowered to act on behalf of the city, right? And her concern is God's glory. So she has a good understanding that Israel is the Lord's inheritance, right? And the land is the Lord's inheritance for Israel, for his chosen people. So she's motivated by that, and she's empowered. The city empowers her. It's not, wouldn't have been easy when there's an army threatening the walls for a woman to go out to the outer ramparts and call out to the army, right? She would have been pushed back, or at least it wouldn't have been easy, is what I feel. Second is, we see she's good at observing and assessing the developing situation, and she decides to do something about it. Her situational awareness is very good. She knows who she needs to talk to, because she calls out, listen up, I want to speak to Joab, right? She knows who is the person who's calling the shots. Then she presents a solution to the person that mattered in a way that he would understand. She challenges that. She knows that Joab, she knows enough of Joab to know that he is very motivated about Israel's interests. So the arguments that she presents to him is presented in his context, in his perspective of what's important, right? She says that when you destroy Abel, you are actually harming Israel. You're harming the cities surrounding. There are a lot of cities that depend on the city. So do you really, is this what you want to achieve, right? So she appeals to his senses and the importance he places on Israel. We have seen that that's very important for him, and she knows that. Then, when she comes to an understanding with Joab that it's not Abel that he is going against, but it is Sheba, she comes to an understanding. So we will give you Sheba, right? He's inside here. We will give you that. She knows, she has the confidence that the city is going to act on with her, right? And she takes prompt action. She goes to the residents of the city, and they listen to her advice. They understand, they recognize the wisdom of the agreement that she has negotiated with Joab. And we must give them credit for recognizing the value of the woman's solution, and they act on it. They promptly behead Sheba, and the situation is defused, because Joab has actually, he wants to eliminate the cause for the rebellion. With that done, Joab is willing to call off hostilities, right? So we see that wisdom is not just about designated leaders. It's not resident in a few people, right? It is not just about knowledge and situational awareness. It is also about recognizing good suggestions, creating an empowered environment for everyone to contribute and acting promptly on good suggestions. So that's what Abel is showing us about wisdom, right? Nobody is better or lesser than the other. They are willing to listen. They're willing to recognize good advice when they see it. Very similar to what, like Santosh said, right? The story of Abigail and David, right? We see the same pattern where David is smart enough, wise enough to recognize the wisdom of what Abigail presents to him, right? So, except that in that story, Nabal, who does not recognize this, in fact, she has to slip away from him, which itself tells you why Nabal is referred to as a fool, because she goes to David without the knowledge of Nabal, because she knows that Nabal is actually going to prevent that, right? So, but there is a word of caution here. What is the Bible calling enduring wisdom? Is it just this the application we took from the previous slide is very broad. You don't need the Bible to tell you all of that. So what is the Bible? What is our spiritual sense of what is enduring wisdom? Right? If you read 1 Corinthians 1:18-25, it tells us that the first thing, the message of the cross was foolishness to those who are perishing, right? And God says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and I will thwart the cleverness of the intelligent. God's purpose can be seen as foolishness to those people who think you know more and better, right? So even the experts in the Mosaic law who thought they could second guess and read what God wanted were foolish because they refused to recognize the significance of the cross, right? So, and the last part of that, right? But for all of us, Christians, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So wisdom that the Bible counsels us is godly wisdom, right? And that is the wisdom that endures. All the others are short-lived. So when you blend all those characteristics we saw in the last slide, along with wisdom that God tempers in you, that through the word of God, through the learning of what God wants us to achieve and do, that is when you have enduring wisdom. That is when what you do endures, right? So that's the thought that we can actually, that's just the extension of that study of what does wisdom mean, what is wisdom in action all about, that I just wanted to blend together. Now to move to the third section, right? This is chapter 21, 1-14. I'm just ignoring the rest of the chapter because we touched on that earlier also, right? So in this narrative is probably, it's not in chronological order. It is not where it is positioned in chapter 21. Many reasons for saying that, because there are references to Saul's family being bloodthirsty and David having, we know that Shimei curses David because he eliminates the family of Saul. And we know that earlier also, David is searching for survivors of Saul's family, and the only person he finds is Mephibosheth, right? So if you look at it, this narrative is probably here, we are seeing there are other survivors of Saul's family. So clearly this is chronologically not in this position. It is much earlier, probably even earlier than where David calls Jonathan's son Mephibosheth and actually invites him to reside in the palace, right, and dine with him. So what is happening in this narrative? One is, it is enveloped, if you notice, between two things. One is a famine, beginning of a famine, and the end is the ending of a famine. So we are told that there's a fertility thing here, right? The land is infertile and there are reasons for that. When we read this portion, we know that the Gibeonites, we see David is actually inquiring of the Lord. Why is it that we are having this 3-year famine? And he's told that it is because Saul and his bloodthirsty family have broken the oath that Israel made to the Gibeonites. As a context, way back in Joshua, we know after Joshua had conquered Jericho and Ai, the people of Gibeon had deceptively come and they presented themselves as people from a faraway place, and they entered into a treaty of protection with Israel. Israel enters into the treaty without consulting God, so they are deceived. But in the Lord's name, they have signed a treaty with Gibeon, saying that they will not eliminate them, that they will protect them. Much later, when they realize that the Gibeonites are actually part of the Canaanites, they are unable to go back on the oath that they have made before the Lord, right? But Saul breaks that. Saul does not recognize the sanctity of the oath that Israel took in the name of the Lord. And we see that he has more or less eliminated the Gibeonites. Remember, where the Gibeonites lived is where the tribe of Benjamin, Saul's tribe, had as their inheritance. So probably there was competition, and he, in his zeal to strengthen his position, he nearly eliminates the Gibeonites. So one of the reasons that is seen as the cause for the famine is Saul's and his family's bloodthirstiness. The way they eliminated, broke the oath, the covenant that Israel had made with the Gibeonites. So that is one thing that we see in that portion. The second is there is also there is a narrative inside that of Rizpah. Rizpah is one of Saul's concubines, and we see how she is mourning for her two sons, as well as the sons of the other concubines, right? The other 5 sons who are killed. And her period of mourning is actually, when you think of it, very long. She's sitting there day and night because she does not allow the birds of prey by day or the animals to defile the bodies that are of the sons who have been killed as a punishment for Saul's crime, right? And they're lying there in the open because that's how, so even in the case of Saul and Jonathan, we saw how the Philistines, the tradition, the Eastern tradition was they would kill people and they would display their bodies. They would not give them a honored burial, right? And this is exactly what has happened to Saul's descendants who have been killed as a punishment by the Gibeonites, right? They are left in the open, but Rizpah is sitting there and protecting the remains. She's not allowing their bodies to be defiled by the birds or the animals. And her vigil is a long vigil. It's several months actually, because it's until the harvest season, and also it is until their bones, the body has decomposed, and it's the bones that are remaining, right? So this long vigil also is intertwined within that. And we see how when David hears about her long vigil and her concern not just for her own children's remains, but also her stepsons, David is moved to extend a honorable burial to everyone, all of Saul's family, Saul's, Jonathan's, as well as these 7 sons of Saul who are killed. He buries them all in Saul's father's tomb. Okay, so we see that the enveloping, it's a narrative of fertility of the land and why fertility is withheld by the Lord, right? So compare the famine that Israel is experiencing to the emotional and personal famine that Rizpah is also experiencing, right? Her life has become barren. She's sitting in this place day and night, protecting the remains of 7 children who are killed. Right? What are your thoughts about her actions? How important is it in the context of what we are reading? And how important is David's merciful action to Rizpah in relation to his action of providing justice to the Gibeonites? Right? Both of this is enveloped within this famine story, within this lack of fertility in Israel's story. How important are both these? That's the question. I know it's a little difficult. Even I found this difficult. But let's talk through this and see whether we can have an understanding of what's happening here. Okay. So I think we see something here is there's justice and mercy at many levels, right? One is upfront, we are told the cause of the 3-year famine, it's because of Saul and his bloodstained family, because he murdered the Gibeonites. That is, it's kind of a very big summary statement right at the beginning. When David inquires of the Lord, this is what he is told. Okay. So one thing is, we know that in verse 1, David inquired of the Lord. Now, first assumption I'm making, I think it's safe to assume that this inquiry, before this inquiry, specific inquiry was done, there must have been much prayer also, right? At the national level, David's level, the priest, there must have been a lot of prayer and petitioning. God had not answered those prayers, right? Because in the end, we are told God answers the prayers. So we can assume that this prayer is not something that happened only in the end, even in the beginning. So the inquiry of the Lord, finding out what could be the reason, must have been preceded by prayers that were not answered. So God is actually telling them that I am a God who keeps my covenants, and I expect it. You are modeling me, and you have to keep your covenants. So God is not going to bless a nation that breaks its covenants, right? Or at least specifically Israel. He's not going to bless Israel with fertility if they break their covenants. Second assumption. So after the sacrifice of the 7 sons, there is a period of time that is happening, right? Before we hear that the sacrifice, I mean, the prayers have been answered. We can assume even there, after that sacrifice, the ritualistic sacrifice of the 7 sons were done, David must have led Israel in prayers for the land. And again, for a period of time, those prayers are unanswered. It's Rizpah's action is covering that period, what Rizpah is doing. So the question is, when does God actually restore fertility to the land? We see that God restores, he responds to their prayer, like Santosh pointed out in verse 14, but it is after both have happened. One, after Saul and Israel's sins have been ritualistically paid for, as well as Rizpah's personal sacrifice and actions have been recognized. And David extends mercy to her, to Saul's family, as a result of her actions, right? So he recognizes this unvoiced plea for mercy, and he has to extend that mercy. So both these have to happen. So the restitution for the wrong done to the Gibeonites, as well as Rizpah's unspoken plea for mercy, had to be addressed before God answered the prayers for restoration. So in a way, I was just thinking, right? Respect for God's love cannot be in isolation, cannot be separated from mercy for your neighbor. You cannot look at this, the bigger picture, and ignore the needy person next to you. That does not work. That's why I think Jesus said, right, these two, when he was asked, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? He did not give one commandment, he gave two. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus is likening the love your neighbor as yourself to loving the Lord. It cannot be divorced, it cannot be separated. And all the laws and the prophets, everything that God desires hangs on these two commandments. So that's the note on which I wanted to close. Manu has put up a verse for us from Ezekiel 33:11. Say unto them, as I live, saith the Lord, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turns from his ways and live. Turn ye from your evil ways, for why will ye die, O house of Israel? Yeah. So God does not take pleasure in the death of the wicked. He wants restoration. He wants us to turn and be restored. So with that, I just want to call a close to today's lesson. I know it was a difficult portion, and I'm hoping that there's something that we learned. I'm not very sure about this last portion especially, so I'm just hoping if any of you have thoughts further, please add. Otherwise, we can close.